Hey, welcome back to another episode of Parker's Pensées. I'm your host, Parker Case, and this is a podcast where we explore all the deepest ideas in philosophy, theology, nature, and life. I love thinking about cool stuff, so come think with me. Today's episode is very special, very stressful for me. We have multiple guests, and that always freaks me out, but I think it's going to go well. I'm really excited about this. I have with me Dr. Samuel Lebens and Dr. Kenny Pierce, and we're going to be talking about the stuff that they both come on my podcast to talk about, but together. I'm really excited. We're going to be talking about Berkeleyan Idealism, Hassidic Idealism, how we figure out, if we live in God's story, all sorts of fun stuff about God and his relation to the world and how we ought to think about it or how we can think about it. I'm stoked for it. If you guys like this podcast, then please consider becoming a Patreon patron or a YouTube member. Those are two ways to support the show. If you guys like this type of content, if you want to see me continue, if you want to see me be able to buy dog food for my dog, please consider becoming a Patreon patron. That would be huge. Not going to commodify myself too much today, but you guys know the drill. Please support the pod. But without further ado, let's jump right in and talk about God as the author of the world and whether or not we live in his mind. All right, Doctors Pearce and Lebens, thanks so much for coming on the podcast, guys.
See,
Thank you.
So I'm not sure like super how this is gonna go, but if the audience is gonna get if they get confused because we go too deep, there are two episodes with both of these scholars solo where we're slowing down to explain terms. So go check those ones out. You can find the link in the description. But let's just kind of jump in and start chopping it up. Um, Maybe real quick for Dr. Pierce, do you think that we live in God's mind?
So I wouldn't express it quite that way. I think that our existence is grounded in or dependent on God's act of willing. So God's kind of activity of willing that the world be is the reason why the world is. And it's a kind of continuous dependence. It's not a matter of God kind of causing the origination of the world. And I do kind of in the model that I've most seriously considered, it is what I call history, the kind of complete chain of cause and effect events that, as it were, comes directly from God's willing. And it's our role in that, in history, that makes us exist. And so I think there's a kind of analogy to the to thing about storytelling to characters existing because of the role that they have in a narrative. But I wouldn't want to say quite exactly that we live in God's mind.
Okay. Yeah. And then Dr. Lieben, to kind of summarize our last conversation, can you help us with that question? Do we live in God's mind? What do you think?
sure. I mean, technically, my position is yes and no. Right? So, um, for the sorts of reasons that Tunis um, expressed, because I agree with him that God's will is what grounds all things in being constantly. That leads me to conclude that there's at least a sense in which all things are ideas in the mind of God, because I think that the sort of power that God has over all things and his will has over all things is characteristic of the power that the mind has over its ideas. But I am careful to distinguish between two perspectives upon reality, and each of those perspectives are, quite important and revelatory in their own ways, even though one is somehow more fundamental than the other, gives rise to the other, and therefore, I would put it this way: that from God's perspective, we are merely ideas in His mind, but that set of ideas gives rise to something like a story. And in the narrative of the story, we are more than merely ideas. We are, you know, people of flesh and blood living around freely in a world that this character called God created for us.
Yeah. Okay. That's awesome. Again, folks, there are two episodes, like multiple hours going on behind in those summaries. So go check those out. But Dr. Pierce, so in my last conversation with Dr. Liebens, we talked about some arguments against like an external world outside of God's mind that I believe Dr. Liebens and Dr. Tyron Goldschmidt give. From like perfect being theism, like God would have to create a perfect world because He's perfect, but there is no such thing as a perfect world because maybe there's a problem with that concept. Therefore, He can't create a world outside of His head. Are you familiar with that argument? And if so, and if not, I'm going to pose it to you anyways, I guess. But what do you make of that kind of argument that God can't create an external world?
Yeah. So to begin with, I love that paper. Um, and and I find this stuff it's really thought provoking. Um, but I wonder if so I think there's still a question about um could God tell a bad story,
Yeah.
right? And whether that would imply divine imperfection if God were to tell a bad story.
Yeah.
If, on the other hand, we say that there might be some sense in which this world is imperfect, but it's not imperfect considered as a story, um, I'm not sure whether that uh, kind of prevents us from saying, well, even if we don't quite buy the whole, even if we don't think the author fiction thing is as close to literal. Maybe that's a good way of putting it, as it is on Sam and Ty's view. If we don't think, even if we don't think it's that quite that close to literal, can't we perhaps make the same move and say that as a story, as a narrative, as a way for history to go, in fact, this doesn't have the kinds of imperfections that we might at first think. We're kind of looking at it from the wrong perspective when we make those complaints. So I'm not sure whether I'm ultimately satisfied with that, but I just wonder kind of if it works in the one case, doesn't it work in the other?
Can I just clarify what you mean, Kenny? So is the thought that, well, look, if you think that fundamentally the world is like a story in the mind of God, then still you've got this question, are there some sorts of stories a perfect God, couldn't or wouldn't tell? And then if you fix the world class story, if you're able to somehow justify um, God's having told this story despite its ugly scenes, maybe the same moves allow you to justify his creating it. Is that what you're saying?
Yeah, yeah.
I don't have an answer. I just wanted to be clear.
Great.
Right. And,
Yeah.
at the end of the day, it might turn out if we explore this in enough depth that the moral of the story is that the two views differ only verbally, right?
Yeah, I hear.
Um,
Intuitively, Tyrone and I were thinking there were certain things that a storyteller would be aesthetically justified in telling as a story, but perhaps wouldn't be so justified in, from his perspective, making real. Now, of course, that doesn't help us in the story because it's as real as anything else is in the story, but at least from God's perspective. Um, but I agree. I agree. That this requires further investigation, and the question, Parker's interested in what he calls the authorial analogy, and the
Mhm.
question is, right, how literally to take the analogy? Is it really an analogy, or is it
Yeah. Yeah.
right.
Well,
Right. Of course, I'm going to agree that nothing could possibly be real the way that God is real, or as real as God.
Mhm,
That's going to be just a standard classical theistic view.
mhm.
And so again, if the difference in levels of reality is part of what's making the difference to what God is justified or permitted to do,
Mhm.
um, then that's going to potentially at least be usable by any classical theist who has that difference in levels of reality.
Yeah, I suppose at some point these might, yeah, uh, as you predict, it could be that these end up being notational variants on one another, and the disagreement is skin deep. I suppose I would like to get theists to recognize how radical their position is if they are, as indeed they should be, committed to the view that God is more real than everything else. Um, and the question is unpacking the consequences of that distinction between God's reality and our own.
Yeah. And can I just mention, this is the thing that is so fantastic about your book, The Principles of
You're
Judaism.
so kind. You're always so kind.
It just because the like the basic principles are things that a lot of people would think, oh yeah, this is kind of a minimal form of Judaism, and you're going to get close to analogous things in the other Abrahamic religions.
Exactly.
And 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 you make this case that's kind of a disturbing case for a lot
Yeah.
of things.
Yeah. All this crazy stuff just falls out of what look like quite
Right.
simple premises, Yeah.
Yeah.
Okay, so I posed the same kind of question that Dr. Pierce posed to Dr. Lebens. Um, when during our conversation, I said, "Well, what about a story? What if that's really what's in mind? What's in focus for God is not the number of palm trees or whatever that planting it talks about, but really the story." Um, and then and Dr. Lebens was really like kind and fair and was like, "Yeah, that's a decent point." Um, but then I thought, why create an external world at all if God could create this kind of world in His mind? And
Well,
so Dr.
indeed.
Yeah, if that kind of world can exist in God's mind, then what would be the point of creating it externally? And when I press the authorial analogy too far, I think like, well, where does Middle Earth, where does the stories of Middle Earth actually exist? Is it in the print, or is it in the mind of Tolkien? And I don't know because Tolkien's not around anymore, so we still have the stories. So, like, is it in the ether? Did you make a abstract object? I don't know. So, Dr. Pierce, like, what do you make of just that question? Like, why would he create an external world if he could create it just in his mind? I guess.
Yeah. So an analogous point is made by Berkeley. So Nicholas Mulbron thought, well, God creates all these mind independent bodies, but because mind body interaction is impossible on his kind of dualist view, it's God always who gives us the perceptions of the bodies whenever they're nearby. And Berkeley says, what are the bodies doing in that story?
Mm,
Right? Like, what's the point? It's not like God, if you can think of it on a chess master type of analogy, that like it's only novice chess players, really, or amateurs, really need a chessboard, right?
Ah,
The really serious chess masters can play the whole game without moving the pieces around
yeah.
because they've got it in their heads. And God wouldn't be the kind of amateur who needs to be moving the pieces around to keep track of what perceptions to cause the way that God does on Malebranche's view.
Mm,
Um, but one thing that you mentioned here that's interesting about the Tolkien case is, of course, that Tolkien's characters don't have an existence only in Tolkien's mind. They become a kind of public common property of a community.
mhm,
And exactly how the metaphysics of that works, and there's issues in philosophy of literature about kind of what's true of the characters,
yeah.
particularly if kind of whoever controls the film rights is going off the rails or something. There are issues about that, but there's a community that those characters are communicated to. And this provides a close analogy to the difference between Berkeleyan idealism and Hassidic idealism, right? That the Berkeley thinks, and there's some tricky questions about how exactly this works for Berkeley, but somehow or other, these finite minds uh, don't seem, on Berkeley's view, to exist just in God's mind. They seem to have some other stronger, deeper form of existence, so that there's, as it were, somebody outside God for God to tell the story to.
Mm,
Um, which is the thing that on the Hasidic idealist view, and many scholars attribute a similar view to Jonathan Edwards, um, that that we too, the other finite minds, are just exist as ideas in God's mind.
So from God's perspective, he's just telling a story to himself, which is quite a big difference. I think it's worth pointing out, just for the background of this, that the philosophy of literature becomes super relevant. Um, you know, there are metaphysicians who think that um, the characters of a Tolkien novel don't exist at all. And that everything we say, I mean, Kendall Walton has this kind of view. So everything we say about a fiction is false. It's just there are some falsehoods that are kind of licensed as a game, right?
mhm, yes,
And it's not just the game of pretending that the characters exist and go to Mordor or whatever, like Mordor, sorry, in the story itself. But then when we compare characters, when we say, oh, Tolkien created a really three-dimensional character when he created Baggins, even that is false, according to Kendall Walton. That's we're playing a game about playing the game called fiction when we're involved in literary theory. Clearly, I think Kenny agrees with me that our talk about fictional characters does, there are lots of metaphysicians. I think Kenny would be one of them. I'm one of them. Thinks that our talk about fictional characters does commit us to the existence of these things. They're not people of flesh and blood, but they're something, right? And the point that Kenny's making, it's a point I take, and I see the relevance of it. And perhaps the disanalogy between the God case and the human case is that, once a human author has created his or her characters, it seems like an entire community is involved in sustaining them in being. But we don't have that in the classical case of God.
Yeah.
Unless
Unless you're Trinitarian.
Chorus.
Yeah. Yeah. So I think probably, I don't know if both of you would agree to this, but I think both of your models and adapting in classical theism are the ontological pluralism. I think maybe are Dr. Pearce, would you call yourself an ontological pluralist, or are you committed to that view?
Um, so I wouldn't describe it that way, but this is another case where it might be a notational variant.
Exactly.
So I don't like to talk about degrees or kinds or sorts of being
Okay.
because I want to just associate being with the existential quantifier and like everything exists. And so, yeah, Klingons exist just like you and I do, and Bilbo Baggins exists just like you and I do. They're not the same kinds of things,
Mm-hmm.
and they don't have the same degree of reality or fundamentality. So what I want to do is partly just because it keeps the logical notation neat, um, is keep kind of existence or being as one univocal concept
Mhm.
that applies to everything, including fictional objects and imaginary objects and so on. But
But you
then,
sometimes restrict the domain of that quantifier
yeah,
according
of course,
to levels of fundamentality, or
right. And so we can actually use the degrees of reality as our quantifier restriction in order to say things like, well, Sherlock Holmes doesn't exist. And when we're talking more carefully, we'll even make that explicit by saying he doesn't really exist.
Hmm.
So I think I'm coming from a very similar place to you, Kenny. And until recently, I wouldn't have liked to use the term ontological pluralism for similar reasons. I mean, my upbringing in the waters of Bertrand Russell, really lead me to for there to be one quantifier, and to reject, what I think is a kind of pernicious and confusing distinction that Meinong has, for example, between existence and being. I just want one type of existence. However, I do think that the theist is committed to God's being more real than us.
Yeah.
That does mean we have something like degrees of reality. Again, like you say, notational variant. I think that could significantly be called a form of ontological pluralism, because there are degrees of this thing called being. But there's a sense in which it's not, like you said, because we only have one quantifier, and we stick to that. So, I don't know. On a Monday, I might introduce myself as an ontological pluralist, and the Tuesday, I might not.
Well, so that was I broached that for the audience who just got lost. I broached it because I wanted to just get some thoughts on imaginary characters. I know, like we talked about, this is really crazy. Some people think they're abstract objects and all that. But if we're going with the idea that God has the most existence, or is the most real being, I think probably it does seem like it brings in Meinong's distinction between being and existence.
No.
Yeah, I know, and everyone freaks out now. Josh Sijuade, I don't know who he got this from, but he got it from someone, I think. We're just using different types or different existential quantifiers, just to say, like, I think it's like mathematicizing the qua move maybe, and just being like, well, qua here it exists and qua not. But so do fictional characters exist or have less being than us, who have less being than God? What do you guys
Yes.
make of that?
Again, I want to say reality and not being there. Right?
Reality.
I don't want to
Okay.
talk about degrees of being. I want to talk about degrees of reality. But look, if some Meinongian says by being I mean what you call being, and by existence I mean what you call real being or real existence, then I'm going to say, well, we have a disagreement about how to represent this cleanly in first order logic.
How best to represent this?
Yeah. Well,
So I,
yeah.
I
Go
don't,
ahead.
I don't guard as keenly as you do, Kenny. Perhaps because I'm just not as rigorous. I don't guard as keenly as you do the distinction between degrees of being and degrees of reality. I kind of see them as the same thing. It's just I don't make a distinction between being and existence and being and existence. Um, when I say that something has less being, I mean the same thing as I say when I think they exist, but they exist less fundamentally, which is in a sense to say they exist somehow less fully. But I still have only got one quantifier. It's the existential quantifier, and when I'm being least discerning, I cast that domain, the domain of that quantifier as broadly as you like, and it captures things with any degree of being or reality. And there are times where we're a bit more discerning, and we qualify the quantifier. We restrict the range of its domain. And sometimes we quantify a domain that only has God in it. The
Yeah.
most real.
Okay, so the fundamentality I think is really helpful because then we could say, well, look, we mean God is most fundamental or the only fundamental thing, and everything else is derivative. And then we go in for, some of the work that Dr. Pierce has done on contingency type stuff. And I think we still probably get the qualitative distinction between the fundamental level, God, and everything that's non-fundamental. Does that still work? Do we still get that like qualitative distinction between God and the rest?
Yeah, I mean, I think um, if you think about fundamentality as I do in terms of grounding,
Yeah.
um, God stands uniquely at the root of the grounding hierarchy, so we can make a sharp distinction between God and whatever is not God. It is a hierarchy with multiple levels, right? So within the kind of not God, there we in turn have levels and degrees, and depending on how the chains work out, it might not always be clear what counts as the same level or whatever.
Yeah.
But we can make a very sharp distinction between God and not God because God stands alone at the root.
Is the grounding, in your view, is the grounding relationship? Is it like an inverted view of like the chain of being? Like usually, I always think of the chain of being as like God being up top, but this is like no grounding, and then things are less grounded, maybe, or
Yeah, I mean, people use the um, great chain of being obviously as a metaphor, an image,
yeah,
and how it gets cashed out um, in kind of metaphysical detail varies. Sometimes it looks more like a claim about value, right?
oh yeah, right,
But of course, because it's coming out of a Neoplatonic tradition where being and goodness are one and the same. So degrees of being just are degrees of goodness.
yeah,
Um, so sometimes I start seeing the attractions of that view. Um, but yeah, it is going to look like it is going to look something like that, where we have a kind of derivation from God. And grounding as an image is a building up image, whereas the chain is a descending down
Is it
image.
descending? Well, and maybe something is communicated by that or kind of hinted at, which is in the Neoplatonist vision of the great chain of being. Classically, there's no volition involved. God's being literally overflows and it flows down. God doesn't even need to be aware
yeah,
of the things beneath it,
yeah,
to which his overflow is giving being. Whereas in the picture that Kenneth describes, God is actively willing things into being. So maybe the choice of the direction in the image is suggested. The overflow suggests something non-volitional, and somehow God's being at the bottom, kind of like holding things up, suggests, as images do, something more volitional.
Sure.
yeah,
Yeah, that's helpful. And of course, we stand in this long tradition here of people in the Abrahamic traditions trying to get some kind of voluntary creation into the bigger Neoplatonist pictures in a way that doesn't happen in someone like Plotinus.
exactly. That's part of what bothered the scholastic Muslim Christians and Jews with Plotinus, right? Was the involuntariness of the creation. I'd like to say, I think a big difference potentially between Kenny and myself, and correct me if I'm wrong, is that as we go up and down this kind of ladder of fundamentality, right? On your picture, all that changes is literally how fundamental or how fundamentally the things on that rung of that level, that level of the ladder, exist. Or how 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 large a degree of reality they have, to use your language. Whereas on my picture, it seems like something else is changing, which is that from God's perspective, you and I are more like impure abstracta, right? What do I mean? You said very helpfully, Kenneth, that fictional characters exist, but they're different sorts of beings than we are, different sorts of entities. And as Amy Thomason points out in her book on the metaphysics of fiction, they're a very strange type of entity because they share some of the properties that we generally associate with concrete entities. For instance, they seem to be created, at a time. They didn't exist before they were created. Those are properties you'd associate with concrete beings. But they also seem to have some of the properties you tend to associate with abstract beings. For instance, they don't have a location in space. You can't bump into them. They're not causally efficacious, right? So what she thinks the ontology of fiction forces us to open up an intermediary category between the abstract and the concrete. She calls them impure abstracta. Now, I want to say that you and I, Kenneth, we're concrete relative to the rung of reality in which we live, right? Because in the story of the world, we're concrete beings. But from God's perspective, we are impure abstracta. Whereas it looks like on your metaphysics, all that changes as we go up and down the ladder is degrees of reality. For me, it looks like something else is changing too. Like, which metaphysical categories do we belong to?
Yeah, I'm not sure. I need to think more about I guess about the metaphysics of fiction to think about whether I disagree with you. Because kind of everything, because I agree with you that everything, all the kinds of things that we want to say are true of me. You can also say are true of Frodo within the story, right?
Yes.
He's made of flesh and blood. He requires food to survive. There are
Yes.
biological facts about him.
Yeah.
And
hairy feet. Frodo has hairy feet.
I didn't want to say it, but yeah.
even though those aren't, even though those sort of things aren't explicitly described in the story, in fact, they're nevertheless true of him in the fiction. And so, so I'm not sure whether that's really going to be different. Something that complicates the matter is, I think we both think of God as atemporal.
Yeah.
Um,
Yeah.
and
Or at
so-
least I tried to stay neutral on that question. So at the very least, I want to make room for his atemporality. Yeah.
right. So then then you're not gonna have the time at which, from perspective
From
outside,
God's
there's
perspective.
not a time at which the characters begin to exist.
True.
Yeah. So I'm not quite sure what to say about that, but it is true that I don't exclusively use the fiction for talking about the kind of grounding that's the issue here. I think it's also similar to the kind of relation to the kind of statue clay relation, and that sort of thing, where you don't always have those sorts of features.
Right. And I think you think that we have a degree of creaturely freedom even from God's perspective.
I've been really cagey on that because I'm really not sure. And the thing is, well, I guess I do want to say, yes, even from God's perspective, it's correct to say that we're free. But that might be true of, in a way, of the characters in a story, I think.
Yeah.
So, and actually, you had some helpful remarks about that, the way that kind of characters once created are often
They can
perceived
surprise their authors, can't they?
Yeah.
they're perceived as making demands on the author. I have
Yeah.
some work under review on this actually.
Oh, I'd love to see that, Jenny.
Sort this out a bit more. So my I think it is correct to say that we have some kind of freedom even from God's perspective. But even from our perspective, I'm not sure whether our freedom is libertarian or compatibilist. And so because I'm kind
Nice.
of always going back and forth on that, I've been real cagey about it in my published work.
I sometimes imagine my younger self going crazy with me about all sorts of things. But one of them is this. I was very committed to libertarian free will.
Me too.
Like so committed that like if you didn't have that, then what's the point of anything like that? And now I find myself caring less. I'm not quite sure, and compatibilism doesn't seem as problematic to me anymore. But it's just funny as one progresses philosophically, the things that one used to find,
Yeah, I used to think that when I started studying philosophy, I thought I could just interest libertarian freedom, right? It's just like
Yeah.
make points and
Yeah.
you see.
Yeah.
And I just the longer I think about it, the more I think I'm not even sure what libertarian freedom would be.
No.
You guys are
Right.
speaking my language. This is amazing. This podcast really took a great turn here. I love it.
Well,
Um,
did we choose that? And what does
yeah,
that mean?
yeah, right. It's all part of the story in God's mind. Um, I want to. There's so many that I want to jump in on, and I hope I can get to them, but we'll see. One for Sam. If we're impure abstracta, do you think that we're like multiply instantiable? Like, do you think that could God be telling other stories with us right now, or
Oh, oh, that's an amazing question. I've never thought about it. And that deserves more thought. I have said that the universe should be looked at as like a series of overlapping stories,
Hmm.
because there's the story that you, Parker, are the main character of, and God's telling that story, and I'm just an extra who sometimes appears on your amazing podcast, right? But then
Yeah.
God's telling my story, and I'm the main character of that story, and likewise with Kenneth. And our stories are set in the same universe, and we're extras in each other's, or support, hopefully supporting characters. But in our own stories, we're main characters. But I think you're asking a more radical question. You say, could God tell a story about a completely different universe that doesn't overlap with our universe, but still has me as a character in it? Whoa. I don't know. I've not thought about it. I don't think I've said anything that would rule that possibility out.
Yeah.
But I suppose there's a sense in which, relative to this story, that story's not happening because it's not an overlapping. It's not a story that overlaps with our story in quite the right way.
Oh yeah, it would be like it would be like a Lewisian concrete universe. We could never like
Something
get
like
to
that.
it or something.
That's something like that. But the question is, would it be more than just a counterpart relation between me and that? And
Yeah.
Sam would actually be transworld identity. But nonetheless, things which are true of Sam in that story are palpably not true of Sam in this story.
Yeah.
So
But you have access to it when you dream. That's the Doctor Strange view. Yeah.
yes,
Yeah. Yeah.
yeah. So
Um,
that's a very cool thing to think about. I mean, I do have this view about the story that God is telling with us isn't necessarily finished because he could edit earlier scenes, right? I think that God has the power to change the past. But I tend to look at that as being something that's happening in the story of our world. The story of our world is the story of a world in which there's this character called God who has the power to change the past. But you could also look at it more fundamentally. God is the author of a story, and the story is in draft. Right? It's not finished yet.
That's fascinating. Well, that point that you brought up about us being main characters in our own story is really, I think, helpful to kind of stave off some of the like psychopathy that comes when you think like, "Am I in the Truman Show?"
Yeah.
And because I think a lot of us get that feeling, especially philosophers, because we think about this stuff. But you're like looking around the corner, looking to see if you can see the cameras, or looking to see if your family members break character, because you do have this feeling of being the main character in a
In a
story.
center. But I think there's
Yeah.
I think there's an implicit threat in religion that a threat actually of hubris. We think we know God, we think we know what God wants for us. We're the enlightened ones who have the true religion, and all those people don't know what the truth is. And it can lead, I think, to a terrible sort of arrogance that I think even borders on idolatry.
Mm,
And the question is how to live a life that uh, in relationship with God, the creator of everything, and not to allow that to get to one's head on the one hand and lead to hubris. On the other hand, religion can make you feel so small and terrible and nothingy, that I'm just a gnat in this, infinite universe. And I think that this authorial analogy is really useful at striking a balance because it says, well, I am the main character of the story in which I live. And God is telling this entire story just to unpack my own narrative.
huh,
But he's telling 8 billion other stories.
yeah,
And in those stories, I'm just an extra. And I think that kind of looking at the world through these multiple lenses can help the person of faith to navigate between hubris and humility.
yeah. Dr. Pierce, anything to add on that? Or if not, I got another one for you.
Just that we should all pray that we don't get one of these gritty reboots that are all the rage these days.
Yeah, amen.
Well, if we do, I know who I'd like to be played by. I'll draw up a short list of.
It's fantastic. For all the movie execs that listen to this podcast, could,
David, you ever published a book with Routledge, Kenneth?
Hmm?
Have you ever published a book with Routledge?
Just the recent debate book. Yeah.
Okay, so if you look at your Routledge contract, it includes the film rights.
Oh,
Yeah.
noticing.
So Routledge owned the film rights to my book on Bertrand Russell and the nature of proposition. So if there are any Hollywood execs out
Yeah.
there who'd like to make that into a movie,
that's awesome. Yeah, they could do a reboot of the God debate book, and they could add in some swords, and it'd be fantastic.
I think you and Graham Hoppy, that'd be a great movie, Ken.
That would be. I'd watch it at least. You get one,
I'd
yeah,
watch
one
it.
or two.
Right.
Well, Dr. Pierce, do you think that we can still use your arguments from contingency if Hasidic idealism turns out to be the case?
Oh, sure. Yeah. It's right. It's all about, what kind of structure do you have to have to arrive at ultimate explanation
Mm.
of what we observe, right? And the fact is that on any of these views, what we observe is real or exists from our standpoint.
Mhm.
And
As real as we are. As real as we are, potentially.
yeah, as real as we are. And so the question is, what kind of grounding or explanation, what kind of explanatory structure would suffice to give a complete explanation of that reality of what's real from our perspective?
Okay.
Right. And that, is going to come back to something like God. I think there are something I've said in a number of places. I think there are kind of more possibilities for what the ultimate explainer might look like, epistemic possibilities
Mm.
that haven't been as thoroughly explored as the classical theistic view.
Yeah.
I think the prospects are not for using something purely naturalistic to do the work, but there's a lot of kind of non-traditional theisms and other kind of that are out there in the epistemic possibility space that haven't been explored very thoroughly. But I think we're going to need something like that at the root is what's going on in that.
Would you throw in like cosmopsychism? Would you say that's like a naturalistic explanation, or do you think that's one of the live options?
Well, so it depends on what we mean by naturalism,
Right.
right?
Yeah.
So when I think about naturalism, I'm thinking like, what is the rival view that is attractive and well motivated? Like when I'm thinking about naturalism as opposed to theism, what's the view that's kind of tempting in a certain mood? And it's the view that kind of in the light of the success of science, maybe we just shouldn't believe anything but science.
Yeah.
Right. That is that and spelling out the details of that are complex. But and if you're going from that view that like we're rejecting metaphysics that goes beyond science, I think you have a hard time in the current state of science defending something like cosmopsychism.
Yeah.
But yeah, a kind of if we get a panpsychist pantheism, right, where kind of all the bits of consciousness add up to one big consciousness,
Yeah.
that would be, I guess, among the views that I'm categorizing as non-naturalistic. But that might be disputed by some of its proponents.
Oh, sure, yeah, and then there's the, like, converse of that, where it's like I think that, like, the universe itself is conscious, and then the consciousness derives down from it, so there's, like, the
Right.
down or up view. Yeah.
Yeah. I
I,
can't completely
That's
agree.
technical too. That's a
as a
technical
matter
term.
of as a matter of policy in recent years, I steer away from using the word natural or supernatural, because until we've completed the natural sciences, like
Ha,
we
ha.
don't, you know, uh, Cato will appreciate this in particular because of his studies in early modern, but philosophy. But the Leibniz-Clark letters. Leibniz describes Newton's force of gravity as like occult magic, right?
Right.
And even though science has come on since Newton, and actually we no longer tend to think of gravity as a force so much as like the effect of dense objects, over the shape of space, I still think very few people would look at Newton's suggestion today and say, "Oh, that's occult magic,"
Mm,
so like what strikes us as natural or supernatural changes as science changes.
mm.
Of course,
Just
of course, Einstein did famously call it action at a distance spooky.
Yeah,
Yeah, yeah,
spooky
right.
action at a distance. But in that case, he's talking, I think, about quantum entanglement, right? Which he hates the idea of.
Right. But of course, he got rid of the, it's a
He
shame.
got rid of Newton's the action at a distance.
In gravitation. So
That's
that
right.
one from
That's
gravity.
right. That's right.
Yeah.
So
So
Yeah.
that's basically like, I believe that's like Hempel's dilemma of like, well, look, either it's complete now or we're gonna complete in the future, but like, yeah, hold
Until
off
we've
until you
until
get
we've
there.
completed physics, it's hard to know what physicalism really is. Till we've
Yeah,
completed the natural
Right.
sciences, it's hard to know what naturalism really is.
yeah.
Um, I I would look at cosmopsychism as a sense, I mean, my intuitions would say, oh, that's perfectly naturalistic. But I suppose other people would say, no, what are you talking about? Mind.
Yeah, yeah. Well, kicking one back to you, Dr. Lebens, do you so I it would depend on the type of Berkeleyan idealism, I guess, but one of your motivations for Hasidic idealism is that it looks like from our depiction of God, he has the kind of control over reality that a thinker does over their own thoughts.
Yeah.
And so therefore internally, that's where the universe exists
or at
in God's
least,
mind.
or at least God has the type of control over uh, concrete objects that would be sufficient to render them ideas in the mind of God.
Ah,
I'm
okay.
not sure
Okay.
that I have quite as much control over my ideas, even as God does over
Good.
his. You know,
For sure. Yeah. Well, so on Berkeleyan idealism, uh, couldn't he still have the same kind of control? Like, because we are ideas, and to be is to be perceived. Like, maybe I'm getting
yeah, it's
Berkeleyan
just he wouldn't
idealism
have
wrong,
that
but
control over art. For Berkeley, God would have that type of control over the things that we call material objects.
uh
And he basically does. Material objects, to Berkeley crudely, material objects are bundles of ideas, ultimately grounded or rooted in the mental activity of God.
mm,
But you and I, on Berkeley's view, and this comes back to what Kenneth was saying about Berkeley, he seems to make room for the existence of an audience, right? Us. And how exactly we're tied in. Sometimes, I mean, Berkeley much better than me, Kenneth. I mean, when I look at it, it's almost as if he wants to say that our minds exist on a level with
mhm,
God's, right? That we don't enjoy less reality than God does. Although
mm.
he can't say all that much about minds because they are for him notions rather than ideas. But Berkeley thinks there's little that we can know or say about minds directly, I suppose. But they don't fall for Berkeley. Our minds do not fall under God's control in the way that material objects do.
So that would be a really big distinction. Is that like control over all the furniture of reality is
Yeah,
it looks like it's the same on both, but
yeah,
not us because
it's
we're not
precise,
subjects. Yeah, Dr. Pierce,
precise.
can you help us out with that?
yeah. So Berkeley very carefully avoids questions about free will and predestination.
Mm,
in Berkeley's lifetime, he eventually became a bishop himself, but it actually was against the law for anyone below the rank of bishop to preach a sermon on predestination,
Whoa.
because predestination was like one of the major issues in the civil wars,
That makes sense.
between Cromwell and the royalists and so forth. And so it actually was like a really, really touchy issue. And he really carefully avoids it, even in his mature writings as a bishop. But he does affirm pretty explicitly a univocal notion of God. So he
Hmm.
thinks that God is a spirit in the same sense that we are spirits, though with an infinite difference of degree.
Yeah.
Um, and he's in later writings, 1732, he's quite explicit on that point.
About the difference of degree of what?
Of knowledge and power and all that kind of stuff.
Okay.
So
But not of reality. He doesn't speak in those terms.
no, no. Yeah. So he says that God is a spirit, but not. He says something about not in the same in the same imperfect manner or degree. So God is a perfect and infinite spirit, but his infinity for him is like mathematical notion of ratio. It's like just
Yeah.
like degrees. Um, Now, and in my work on Berkeley, I've argued that Berkeley holds that in certain ways we collaborate with God in constructing physical objects, and that Berkeley needs to hold that view in order for his anti-skeptical strategies to work. And so actually, Berkeley thinks that the world, this is coming back to this authorial analogy.
Mm.
Berkeley thinks that the perceived world is literally a discourse spoken by God. So
Hmm.
the material world is, and I say literally purpose. Its structure is a grammatical structure, and it is a language, and we learn it the same way that we learn languages like English in
So
childhood.
God has laid down these parameters that are grammatical in form.
Yeah, but I've argued that Berkeley endorses a kind of publicity of language thesis.
Hmm.
And so it turns out that in order to create the language of nature, God has to instill in us certain interpretive habits. And without and the language kind of can't be constituted without our practice of interpreting it the way we do. And so we kind of parse the language by grouping ideas into objects according to certain rules. And all of this is part of how the perceived world is constituted.
Mhm. Mhm.
Well, so that's really super fascinating, and I'm wondering, trying to like synthesize this stuff. Is that compatible with like some of the work that's going on in like information theory, or those who would say that like fundamentally everything is math? Those kind of things. Like, could that count as the language, or does it have to be like a? Is it Hebrew that we're all like made of like Hebrew symbols or something?
So the language, the letters of the language for Berkeley, I mean, it's useful to compare with Galileo. So Galileo famously says that the characters, the letters of the book of nature are geometrical figures.
Yeah.
Mhm.
Okay.
And Berkeley is denying that because
Oh.
he, in a certain way, is opposed to this mechanistic view of the world.
Okay.
He thinks the letters are sensible qualities like
Huh.
redness and roundness and so forth, as detected by our senses. But he does think at one point he describes Newton's Principia as the best grammar manual of the language of nature. Actually
Hmm.
calls it a grammar manual. And so somehow the math is coming in at this higher level of abstraction where you try to give a precise state of the grammar of nature. And in that same passage where he describes Newton's Principia as a grammar, he also draws the distinction between the native speaker's knowledge and the grammarian's knowledge.
That's really fascinating because you could say the sensible qualities like or qualities like red or whatever is, it's really just a wavelength and you can describe it mathematically. But then you get like old school Frank Jackson coming through and being like, well, those aren't the same things because that's phenomenal versus so so I
Right.
don't know.
And so his view is going to be that's some kind of abstraction that's constructed by linguists or grammarians, right?
Okay. Okay. Okay.
In this that can kind of be distinguished between there's the sounds that native speakers make and the way psychologically native speakers process the language.
Mm.
And then there's all these abstractions that linguists construct in order to give kind of simple and precise rules for how the language functions. And that's the distinction Berkeley thinks exists between the ordinary person and the physicist in the interpretation of nature.
Interesting.
So I do think in the Hasidic tradition, I mean, one needs to know how literally to take them, but they do speak, Parker, just like you said, about the world being built out of the Hebrew letters. Indeed, actually recombinations of the 10 statements that God made in creating the world in Genesis 1. Although if you count, he only makes 9, but the rabbis find a way of making one of them into 2. There are 10. Of course there are 10. Nice round number. I don't know how literally to take them, but I think that there's at least a leaning towards thinking of the world as linguistic through and through, that God is telling a story. Stories are sets of sentences. So it's not quite the Berkeleyan picture that you get of kind of God kind of bringing into being phenomenal content by like vividly imagining something, so telling a story, like taking certain sentences and saying, let's say these are true for the sake of the story. I just wanted to say, I love this idea about Berkeleyan discourse. This must be your book on Berkeleyan philosophy of language.
Yeah.
What's that called again?
The title is Language and the Structure of Berkeley's World.
Yeah. One day you and I will discuss it after my having studied it carefully, because it sounds really, really important. But what's interesting is Berkeley was a contemporary of some of the founders of the Hassidic movement. They weren't in conversation with one another, but it's at the same time. And some of the early Hasidim, most of them speak in the ways that I'm trying to unpack. The world is a story in the mind of God, and ultimately, only God's mind is in control, and et cetera, et cetera. But some of them do talk as if what the story means is up to us to interpret, as if we're somehow in a collaborative. I don't know how to render that consistent with the view that actually, from God's perspective, we don't exist, right? Are these two different streams of Hasidic thought? Are they confused about something? But it's just interesting to note that some do talk in that way, that, God somehow lays down certain parameters, but it's in collaboration with us that the meaning of this whole thing is filled in. I'll have to come back to it once I've studied your book more carefully.
Can I ask a historical question? So there's this funny thing that happens, that in the Western tradition, it is very hard to find any clear example of an idealist, right? There are disputed examples like Gregor of Nyssa, or like how does Platonism relate to idealism? But it's hard to find a clear example before the late 17th century.
Yeah.
And then you suddenly get this group of people apparently developing it
independently. Yeah.
Leibniz, Berkeley, Collier. There's a dispute about how independent Edwards' development was. His earliest idealist statements seem to be before he knew about Berkeley. And so these Hasidic rabbis are also developing it independent.
I'm pretty certain it's independent.
Yeah. To what extent are they in contact with the same intellectual milieu? Like, do they know about Montaigne and Descartes? Are the reasons why idealism becomes plausible to them? Could they be the same?
No, these are some of the, most closeted Eastern European Jews. They didn't come from the enlightened Western European Jewish communities, the Hasidic thinkers. Those Jews, the Jews in Western, in Germany and in the UK and in France, they would have been reading secular philosophers. They would have known about Descartes, and it's harder for me to believe that these people in these kind of peasant villages in the Ukraine and Poland, and it's hard for me to imagine that they knew their Descartes from their Leibniz, from their Spinoza. But maybe I'm wrong. I'm not a historian of the period, but it is hard for me to believe that that they really had anything more than a passing acquaintance, if that, with the names of these great people.
Right. So it's interesting, because these other guys, I tend to think there must have been something in the intellectual climate that claims why the idea's time has come.
Yeah.
But if the Hasidic rabbis are in a totally separate intellectual milieu, then it
Yeah.
must be kind of just a coincidence that it happened at the
Yeah,
same.
at the same time. Like, although there is a story to tell perhaps about the influence of Far Eastern thinking
Yeah.
over Europe at that time. And I know that some people have done some research into that, and that kind of popular. So not it's not that the Hasidic rabbis were reading any Sanskrit texts, but the kind of rumors about rumors about what Eastern philosophy had to teach were kind of percolating. Again, I don't know. I mean, to what extent, like to what extent had Hindu and Buddhist thought been heard of in Western Europe in these periods?
There's a little bit of limited knowledge of Buddhist philosophy. There's more knowledge of Neo-Confucianism,
Right.
because there's a bunch of that stuff in Bale, and Berkeley actually mentions in late works Neo-Confucian philosophers.
Nice.
And Locke mentions them too. The Europeans call them the literati, the scholars of China. So that's kind of what they had the most information about. Leibniz was actually considered the leading Protestant expert on China.
Was he
And
really?
yeah, he wrote a book, A Discourse on the Natural Theology of the Chinese.
Wow.
Amazing.
And Malebranche also wrote a book called A Dialogue Between a Christian Philosopher and a Chinese Philosopher.
Yeah.
Um,
When you get as late as Schopenhauer, then
Sure.
you've got like popular Hindu thought has made it into kind of Western.
right. And there is an argument about whether Hume could have been influenced by Buddhist ideas.
Really? Wow.
Yeah, because Hume, when he kind of went on a retreat to finish writing the treatise, he went and stayed actually this like Jesuit center where the Jesuit who had been in, I think it might be modern day Nepal, in somewhere, had like brought back his notes too. And this guy, the story is this Jesuit shows up in, somewhere in South Asia, and he says, I want to tell you about our religion. And they said, we will listen to everything you have to say as soon as you spend 3 years studying our religion and our belief.
Good
Wow.
for them.
And he said, and good for him for saying, sure.
Absolutely.
Right. And,
Right.
and so that's what he did. And he brought back all of his notes and
Amazing.
was at the place where that guy's notes were.
Wow.
I see. So Hume was there.
But we don't know whether he actually looked at them at all.
No. They,
Yeah. Well, so
I raised that
Sounds
kind of
back.
only because you try and find. Sorry, Pat, you didn't mean to.
no worries. Go ahead.
It is a mystery why in the Muslim, Jewish, and Christian medieval period, it's hard to see any rationalist who you could say, oh, there's an idealist. Maybe in some of the more East mystical texts, things that sound a bit more. But there's this whole tradition in India, Buddhist and Hindu idealism, and why all of a sudden do these ideas emerge in Western Europe, the New World, and Eastern Europe simultaneously? Interesting question.
Yeah. Bringing us back to like a classical theist type things, and the debate maybe between an external, like an idealism where there's an external world, like a Berkeleyan idealism, and a Hassidic idealism where the world exists in God's mind. If you're a classical theist, to me it seems like there might be a parity like breaker or something like that. If you think that God's thoughts are his being, like if you're going for simplicity and you think like, well, no, everything in God is God, including his thoughts. Dr. Lebens said like, well, last time we talked, he was like, well, yeah, God is not his thoughts. Dr. Pearce, I wonder what you would make of that. Do you think that God is his thoughts? This is a really big concern for me. This is why I'm like loosely holding on to simplicity, but I love like theistic conceptual realism type stuff and grounding stuff in
How
God's
simple is
mind.
your God, Kenny?
Yeah, right.
Yeah. So I tend to think that we can think of God's thoughts and God's will as kind of emanating from God in some ways, similar to the creation. It's how I tend to think about it in terms of just being able to make some kind of sense out of it.
Hmm.
Have trouble understanding the really strong divine simplicity views you get in people like Ibn Sina or Aquinas.
Yeah.
And of course, they would say, well, of course you can't understand it as a finite discursive thinker, right? But um, but I tend to think of the kind of the essences of possible things as somehow emanating from God
Okay.
in a way that's logically prior to the creation.
Okay. Um, are they? Yeah. So I don't want to press you too much because it's not like this is you've written like a ton on it or anything like that.
So
But
your God can be as simple as you like, basically, because the thoughts and wills are things that are downstream of God.
Yeah, something like that.
but they're like restricted or restrained by like his nature, which is simple, right?
Uh, yeah. So everything that can possibly exist has to be capable of following from the divine nature somehow, because the divine nature necessarily stands at the root
Yeah.
of existence.
So we got like his free knowledge and stuff, his natural knowledge. Do you? I forget. Like, do you go in for middle knowledge?
Um, so I'm pretty convinced that God has knowledge of counterfactuals of creaturely freedom,
Uh huh.
if that's all you mean by middle knowledge. But of course, that could be true on a compatibilist view as well.
Right. Yeah.
And some compatibilists take the counterfactuals of creaturely freedom to be free knowledge, and others, like Leibniz, take them to be pretty much natural knowledge. Um, so I've recently come to take the Molinist view more seriously.
Oh no.
Um, Not actually because I think it makes us freer than the compatibilist view. I'm not convinced that it does.
Yeah.
Um, but actually because of these sort of reflections on the relation of authors to the characters.
Yes,
And
man.
I
That's
feel
good.
a better model of for how to
Mm.
think of our relation.
Like when you're unpacking a character, you're kind of unpacking all these conditionals, right? How would they act in this situation? And
Yes.
Well, and something that I like about that analogy is that it's not literally impossible for the author to make the character do something else than what the character seems the author to demand. It's not literally impossible. It just somehow violates the integrity of the fiction.
yeah.
And that seems like what we want to say about God and human free will.
Yeah.
Mhm.
God could make us do anything, but there's a limit to what he can make us do without violating our integrity as characters.
And and and
That
and
might be how we feel God. We might feel that God does violate the integrity of
yeah.
Pharaoh, for example,
Yeah.
in the Exodus narrative when he hardens his heart.
Hmm.
It just goes too far. I mean, I'm not criticizing God, but goes too far if what you want to do is preserve the integrity of Pharaoh.
Well, so this is really fascinating because certain things like in the New Testament, like the conversion of Paul, it seems like it's almost like Deus ex machina, like bam, like I'm changing your whole character. And in that case, if you go for like reasons, responsiveness, and free will or something like that, you'd say, well, no, he didn't own the mechanism by which he came to those views. And you're like, okay, then he's not morally responsible. But in that case, I don't want to say he's morally responsible for his salvation anyways. So that one doesn't matter. The Pharaoh case, I would be like, uh-oh, like if he holds Pharaoh responsible, but he messed with his integrity, I would want to say like maybe he presented him with his goodness and that hardened his heart, but he knew what it would take, but he didn't like override. But yeah, I the points, yeah, well taken, just freaks me out.
I mean, I
I
think
guess Paul was overwhelmed, but I guess had he had a more evil nature, he could have resisted.
Yeah.
Uh, you know, he went blind, and it was only when the disciple comes and prays for him, his
That's
eyes
true.
open. Maybe he said, "No, I'm going to stay blind. I hate that Jesus guy." There was
yeah.
some choice.
But the whole character,
So
his whole character was based on the story, right? Like his whole entire life led up to that moment.
Yeah, I mean, you can look at Paul. I mean, look, I'm not Christian,
I
but I
know,
say,
you know a lot
y-
here. That's good.
but you look at Paul and you say, um, his anti-Christian stage is part of what makes his story so compelling,
100%.
right?
Mhm.
There's a terrible story in the Talmud that Kenny will know because I quoted it in my book when Moses gets to see into the future in the Talmud. It's a story about Moses gets to see in the future this great rabbinic figure called Rabbi Akiva, who was roughly a contemporary of Jesus, a little younger than Jesus. Um, he was killed in the Hadrianic persecutions, and Moses gets to see his martyrdom.
Mm.
And um, God says, and Moses is like, what, why did you do that to Rabbi Akiva? Why didn't he get that? Why did he get that terrible ending? He was such a righteous person. And God's answer to Moses in the story is, shut up, shtuck, right? It means shut up. Uh, um, so it rose up in my mind before me, which I unpack as like in the authorial analogy that no, if you really understand Rabbi Akiva's life from the point of view of an author, this is terribly tragic. That's part of why God's uncomfortable with the question and says, shut up. It's not a nice thing for God to have to confront. But actually, Rabbi Akiva was a zealot, and his death as a martyr is somehow, there's a poetic integrity to his life. It's terrible thing to say if you're a fellow human being, but God from his authorial distance can speak that way. And I suppose I'm saying something similar about Paul, that like his, if it had been someone who'd been less anti-Christian, the story would never have been as compelling.
Right.
Right.
Yeah.
If Paul pre the vision of Damascus had been kind of lukewarm on Christianity, it's nowhere near as good a story.
Right. Yeah. Dr. Pearce, I think I cut you off for there. Yeah.
No, all I wanted to say is that I do think that in both the Pharaoh case and the Paul case, I agree that there's a kind of narrative and integrity and a kind of psychological intelligibility
Mm-hmm.
to that. It's not, even though as radical as Paul's shift is, it doesn't look like someone's character changing after a brain injury.
Yeah, he still had a reason for his actions and choices, right?
Well,
And there's a continuity.
Yeah.
And there's something about his character as a person who never does anything halfway.
That's true.
And who has this kind of very zealous and dedicated attitude, and like he switches sides, but he's playing for the other side in the same way as he played his side, right?
That's a good point.
That's just
what do you make of the Pharaoh story, Kenneth?
Well, I think it there's there are a lot of places, as Spinoza emphasizes, though it's not someone whose biblical interpretations I always follow, but there are a lot of places in the Bible where it talks about divine agency isn't necessarily distinct from natural events, right? That God does that. And it does seem like if I recall correctly, the text actually alternates between saying God hardened Pharaoh's heart and Pharaoh
hardened his own heart. That's correct.
Yeah, and so it may be that the kind of part of what we want to say in the text is that there's not actually a strong distinction there. That is, the author wrote the story this way and the character acted this way are kind of two levels of explanation.
Yeah.
And we might want to say that both are happening in every one of those instances.
Right. And naturalistically, just looked at psychologically, there are choices that subsequently deprive us of our freedom increasingly. Like the habits of an addiction, right, that are freely entered as we find ourselves deeper and deeper in the addiction. We've lost more and more freedom.
Yeah, there's intranarratival like continuity and psychological reasons. This I wanted to end with one last question. This one's maybe more for me and like a therapy session here. I think a lot about the simulation hypothesis because I work in campus ministry. A lot of student athletes that I work with will bring this up. They listen to Joe Rogan and Lex Friedman. So I've been doing a lot of like thinking about it and finding that wow, there's a lot of overlap between the authorial analogy, which I love so much, and the simulation hypothesis, which I work so ardently to try to destroy. And more like the univocal sense of the simulation hypothesis, because yeah, maybe you can use it as a metaphor, but I think the authorial analogy is better. Blah blah blah. Metaphors aren't as good as analogies. So, anyways, you could pitch it as an analogy, sure. But the univocal sense that we literally live in a computer simulation, and there's just a human or like a alien that's like one level of reality below us, that they're our creator. So there's this argument. It's kind of Putnamian, where Putnam, tries to refute brain in a vat simulation, brain in a vat hypothesis, whatever, skepticism with with content externalism. So I don't mean to bring you guys into content externalism stuff because I know that's rough. But I have this view that if you're a complete sim, if you live in a simulated world, then everything you're in association with is simulated. You come to think that you live in a computer simulation and this world is not the most real world. It seems like you acquire a belief that your beliefs aren't true or aren't true qua base reality. They're true. Maybe so. David Chalmers has this article, "The Matrix is Metaphysics," where he's like, "Look, qua the Matrix, Neo's views are true, but qua base reality, they're not true." And I think it was a similar thing for simulation hypothesis. Like you get to believe one or the other, though. If you believe that you're living in a computer simulation, then why believe any concepts about base reality? Because, like, how do you know? It seems like it's inscrutable. You know, but then the problem here, so I'm rambling here, but the problem is then it carries over to theism and maybe idealism type stuff. How can we reason about the reality outside of the reality that we've been designed to reason in, I guess? So like we're thinking about the nature of the world apart from the world that we live in, base reality. We're living in a story, but we're talking about the author. How can we do are we able to do that without the author, like, revealing stuff to us? And do you guys see the problem here? I'm just totally rambling, but
I see the problem. I indeed I've written about it in
mm,
that, um, you know, and I bring up Putnam's response to the brain in the vat
cool. Awesome.
example in my writings, and I've argued that if God hadn't revealed himself to us, right, there might be a conceptual problem that we kind of locked into the layer of reality that we're in,
That's
such that
cool.
even when we try to think about layers of reality more fundamental than our own, we somehow systematically fail because we're not directly acquainted with things, beyond our ken,
Yeah.
directly acquainted with things. But I have two things to say about that. So first of all, I think some of the Hasidic masters had a similar worry, and they said, "Oh well, okay. So it turns out most of the things we think when we think about God are like false or they break down, but that's okay. Um, it's a kind of a mystical attitude that says, you know, push language and logic to their very limits. You feel yourself forced to say things that, by your own lights, you recognize can't be quite sensible or truth valuable, and you allow those kind of strings of nonsense somehow to point you in the direction of ineffable truths,
Mm,
right? And this is part of the reason why a lot of the Hasidic masters eschewed philosophy. They didn't like philosophy. Just live the life you're living and live in relationship with God. And when you try to think too hard about God, it's all going to break down.
yeah.
And that's as it should be. However, don't I don't follow them to that conclusion because I think that once God has revealed himself to us, he can give us the linguistic apparatus
Totally.
to think about him and to think about base reality. I also have a paper under review that argues that if there is even a negligible chance that we are a sin, then there's a much greater chance that we're characters in some story or other,
Oh, that's
which
good.
suits my suits my theistic conclusion. So the sim argument may be a gateway drug
Yeah,
to
man.
theism.
That's awesome. Yeah, Dr. Pierce.
Yeah. So I would say there's some reasons to be dubious about the amount of sense that could be made of the univocal simulation hypothesis.
Right.
And the problem is, in order for the univocal simulation hypothesis to be true, it needs to be the case that the deeper reality is correctly described by us as a computer.
Right.
And even if you don't buy the whole Putnam thing from beginning to end, there and it also needs to be, in order for it to be a skeptical hypothesis, it needs to be correctly described by us as a computer in contrast to a physical reality,
Yeah.
right?
Yeah.
Or sort of this sort of physical reality we think it is. And so part of what's going on in that Chalmers paper is, why should we think this is a skeptical hypothesis rather than a surprising discovery about the nature of reality?
Mhm.
How is it undermining common sense beliefs about tables any more than quantum physics does?
Right. Because just
Right.
zeros and ones instead of superstrings or whatever.
The
Right.
underlying reality of physical nature is going to be surprising, whatever it is.
Yeah.
Yeah. And so if you think, but I think, if you're not saying it's exactly that, but you're saying, well, it's some kind of analogy, well, then maybe you are making a really similar move to what
Yeah.
a lot of theists are making, where
Yeah.
you're like maybe talking about the intentions of the simulator is the best way to kind of understand the world and
Yeah.
thinking of it in an agential way. There was a great, it was, it must have been nearly a year ago now. There was a great article on the Onion about how the simulation hypothesis was confirmed when a giant pop-up appeared in the sky saying that you're coming to the end of your free trial.
Yeah.
It
Yeah.
had this whole thing about like the reason there's evil in the world is because the subscriber is too cheap to pay for universal premium,
Yeah.
which is just amazing.
Yeah.
Right.
Yeah. Yeah. Yeah, Dustin Crummett actually wrote a paper on that saying, like, we can collapse natural evils down to moral evils through simulation hypothesis because
Hmm.
it's the simulator's fault, not God's. But that's kind of a weird view. I like him, but that's it might collapse. But, Dr. Pierce, I actually use your, some of your work on contingency stuff to kinda run through the univocal simulation hypothesis and say, "Well, like, look, we still need an explanation. The finite or the contingent simulator still cries out for explanation in a way that a necessary being doesn't. So we can kind of run through, and then there's some like all the arguments from logic or abstracta. If those go through, they run right through, all the way straight back to base reality, most based reality, I guess. Yeah.
Yeah,
Um.
someone
Yeah.
worried about me. Are we, how do we know a story in the mind of God? Maybe a story in the one of God's, we might be lower down.
Mm,
But the thing is, as long as God's right at the top, I'm okay.
yeah.
When we pray to God, that's who we're praying to. We're praying to the one at the very top, or bottom, however.
Yeah. Well, so I've thought about that with, I used to try to just blast simulation hypothesis, and then I thought, well, where's the conflict here? What if we are like, if we're somehow, if we're Sims with a consciousness like base reality image bearers of God, then would Christ's sacrifice not count for, a simulated Parker like it would in a base reality Parker? So I wonder, there's theological questions, Dr. Lebens too, like you have different theology than us, but
Sure.
just thinking like, do the theological implications run down through the simulation? And insofar as this reality is a good replica of base reality, it seems like they would, but I don't know how we'd even know that though.
Yeah, I'm not convinced that there's a significant theological problem
Mm,
in admitting the possibility that we're Sims.
yeah,
Um, could still be the case that God's will has been revealed to us. In the simulation, could still be the
yeah,
case.
yeah,
I need to think about it more to be certain, but it's just not at all obvious to me that
yeah.
there's a big problem.
Many of my theist friends, theist philosopher friends will, and like, yeah, Mike Humer too. Well, they'll like punt to, hey, look, that requires machine functionalism. Machine functionalism false. We got, Chinese nation, Chinese room, and then some of my other dualist Christian philosopher friends were like, well, if dualism's true, then perhaps we could, latch onto the psychophysical laws through computation, and a soul could get associated with this. I was like, dang it!
Yeah.
So that one took away my
Yeah, not
argument there.
obvious to me that it's not obvious to me that Nick Bostrom is right in thinking that his functionalism, or he calls it substrate in
Independent.
independent.
Yeah.
It's not clear to me that that's as pivotal to his argument as he thinks it is.
Right.
As you said, it could be that certain computers get ensouled.
Yeah.
Uh,
Yeah. Yeah. Um, well, this has been awesome, you guys. Like, I genuinely, both of you, I think the way you guys think, but I'm so much back. Like, you guys are so years ahead of me. So it's so helpful to read your stuff and be like, oh, cool. Someone else thought of this.
uh,
Great. Like, it's been a huge blessing to me. I want to, it's good for my audience, but for me, generally, like, both of you guys, the way you think, I really appreciate it. This has been a super fun episode for
well,
me.
pleasure. I'm honoured to be compared to Kenny Pierce, so that's
Hmm.
not many people think as clearly as that. So I'm very happy.
Well,
Thank you.
that's very flattering. But this is a great conversation. Thank you both.
Yeah. Yeah, yeah, maybe we'll have to get another one going. Folks, leave a comment what you liked, and maybe we can coax them into coming back on. For now, that's going to have to do it. This has been Parker's Pensées, and as always, all glory to God.